Good evening to you all. This is Evening Report on Monday night in March, very early March, in the week immediately after the New Zealand First obviously won a very decisive victory in Northland, the New Zealand electorate that is causing so much attention, particularly today and no doubt the rest of the week. Here in New Zealand, the issue of the John Key government's credibility has arisen, especially since Winston Peters achieved such a huge win against the National Party machine in Auckland, in Northland. But what is the mood in Southeast Asia after it was revealed the New Zealand government, via the GCSB, had been found to be spying on our friends and our significant trading partners in Southeast Asia, in particular the ASEAN nations? We crossed a former Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs, Matt Robson, who was in Hanoi. Good evening, Matt.
Hello to you, Selwyn, and thank you for the introduction.
You're very welcome. What is the mood up there in Southeast Asia, Matt? I understand that you've been travelling for around about a week, and that mood in particular on the view of New Zealand since these spying allegations have been made public.
Well, where I am is at a World Conference of Parliamentarians, and I'm here to discuss the issues of nuclear weapons or getting rid of nuclear weapons. But clearly there's an interest for me, in reaction to New Zealand. First, to say that not that many people in these countries are that aware of issues in New Zealand, certainly not the win of New Zealand First in Northland. They know more about the cricket, and I've been having lots of condolences today on that. But the delegations I've talked to from Vietnam and from China, who are very circumspect in regard to what they say in relations with other country, have certainly shown a sense of bemusement and perhaps even bewilderment as to why New Zealand, a country which they have a regard for and treated as a friendly country, certainly between here in Vietnam and in China, a growing relationship in so many areas, not just trade, but so many other education and cultural exchanges and sporting exchanges. So a growing awareness of the relationship with New Zealand at the official level, at least. And so a sense of bemusement as to why New Zealand treats these countries as somewhere to be spied upon, as though they are enemies. And let me say that the question of terrorism and combating terrorism, not just individual terrorists, but of course organizations and even state terrorism, is something that the Vietnamese take seriously and are committed to. They have a number of bilateral relations with countries to stop terrorist activity and money laundering, etc. So they cannot understand why, in a very polite way, New Zealand would somehow or other need to spy on them. Because if the justification is terrorism, they're against it, and they want friendly relations with New Zealand.
Does the issue of confusion stretch across to whether or not they consider, well, is New Zealand doing this for trade benefit? And does that make a difference to the way that they actually engage with us, do you think?
Well, they're very, very careful on that question, because clearly Vietnam is wishes to have good relations right throughout the world, and it trades with so many countries. And here, one of the emphasis of delegations is to have bilaterals on trade, and I'm sure that the New Zealand embassy in particular follows up with that, because there's a New Zealand MP's delegation. But yes, they can understand why, if you're a trading partner, what it is that you're spying for can only perhaps be economic secrets. Now, for example, Vietnam is involved in the TPP negotiations. So obviously the question is being asked is the position of Vietnam being tracked, and who is it being handed over to? Interesting enough, when you look at all the flags here, New Zealand and Australia stand out as being countries with the Union Jack, and all the former British Empire countries and later Commonwealth countries have their own flags, including Canada. So there's, I think, underlying, as I say, the politeness of the response to my discussion with people who emphasise there's no threat they feel from New Zealand or wish any harm to New Zealand. Has New Zealand really taken an independent position, or is it the stalking horse, if you like, the method that larger powers who have perhaps a more sinister motive for having an advantage over trade secrets, economic secrets, political secrets. New Zealand acts as a messenger for them.
And that, what you're referring to is whether or not New Zealand is the messenger boy for the United States in this kind of area.
Well, yes, and it's ironic given that 50 years ago, when this country was at war with the United States, the United States waged war against it. New Zealand sent a brigade of soldiers or a company of soldiers, and in a war, hostilities, you kill people and get killed. There isn't any hostility voiced about New Zealand's role. I mean, clearly, if it was examined, it would be seen as that New Zealand was an attacking country, an aggressor country to us. But they put that aside. And yet here again is another form of hostility against Vietnam. And that is what I think they don't quite understand, that even if countries do look at other secrets about other countries, why Vietnam? China, I'll perhaps talk later. I've had some talks to some of the Chinese, but more difficult because they are not a host country. There's a pretty disciplined group, fairly tight-lipped about what their opinion is on anything, really. That was I haven't loosened anybody up too much there. But the Vietnamese were able to talk generally and friendly.
If you raised the issue of the United States and the engagement that it has with Vietnam, and clearly there's been a rapprochement of sorts that has gone on over the last decade in particular between the United States and Vietnam. But do you detect a sensitivity to United States perhaps controlling New Zealand spying on countries in Southeast Asia, particularly as you point out that you're in Vietnam at the moment?
Well, yes, the Vietnamese are well aware that New Zealand puts itself forward as a reputation of having an independent foreign policy. And of course, when they campaigned for the vote for the Security Council, then that was one of the factors they put forward. Look, you're voting for a country that takes its own stand on international issues. And then to find that New Zealand takes this position for the most powerful group of countries in the world, allied to the United States, that they actively don't have an independent role. They do it on behalf, if you like, of other countries, with the excuse being that we're fighting terrorism. I come back to that because the Vietnamese are very strong too against fighting terrorism. In fact, they've had state terrorism in the form of the United States war against them, the French before that, and they know what individual terrorism is as well. So we come back to New Zealand. They just want good relations, and yes, it doesn't help. I think the only thing that allows New Zealand, if you like, to get a little bit away with what they're doing, the role they're playing, is that the Vietnamese have a longer game. Their Prime Minister was recently in New Zealand, has looked towards very good relations. By the way, I believe that for New Zealand, Vietnam is becoming the fastest growing trade partner we've got. There's about $500 million that is exported to Vietnam, which New Zealand wants to raise to $2.2 billion, and a lot of products here that as Vietnam progresses, because by the way, it's an impressive growth rate in Vietnam. That's not to say there aren't problems, of course, but if you're looking at any other countries that recovered from a war with as little help, international help, as Vietnam has had, what they've done is enormous, impressive.
When the Prime Minister John Key recently was up in South Korea, immediately after the bilateral joint press conferences, John Key alluded to the fact that the President of South Korea did not raise this issue of spying, and his take on that was that South Korea didn't care, that there was a mood in Southeast Asia where they were indifferent to such things, and that it really didn't hit the radar. And I think his words were that basically, it was a tirade of insults toward Edward Snowden and the reporters here in New Zealand that have been reporting these revelations relating to the GCSB spying in the region. Do you think that John Key is correct, Matt, in assessing that at the highest level there's an indifference and simply they do not care?
I think he knows quite the opposite. Clearly, this is what he puts out for public consumption, and it's quite frightening the way he attacks the messenger Snowden, because other countries don't do that. They're analysing in great detail what Snowden has shown is happening. And we saw that with Germany. I mean, the fact that the Americans were spying on Germany, there was no polite reaction. Well, the South Koreans too. I mean, if you're talking about that, they have their own game, and New Zealand's not figuring largely in it. They are a close ally of the United States in the matters that are played out in South Korea, or in that region, sorry. But they also have their own different set of objectives. They want a close relationship with China, for example. And having mentioned China, this is why I don't think John Keir is correct. They quite often don't say anything openly. That's not the way their diplomacy works. But of course, they look askance at what Australia has been doing in taking part in the American containment policy of China, and that doesn't help the relations that Australia has with China. I mean, Australia has its own reasons for skating on that thin ice. New Zealand's been a little bit different and not openly embraced let's contain China, although Australia has a greater military capacity to worry the Chinese in terms of the role it will play. But clearly it's taken notice of that New Zealand is not as independent as it says. So if you like, the credibility goes down. What we get away with is that because we're not seen as a massive threat, then we're not the main target for any retaliation or anything like that. But it'll be let known to New Zealand that where there was access before, access won't be so readily granted. Clearly, that if New Zealand's using its resources, including its obviously diplomatic missions, its access to get access to information which is none of their business, and to pass it on to the United States, then those countries will close that off. So if we want to be, we have a choice to make. If we believe that the world is going to continue to be run by this little club, then we'll follow that. If we really want the world to take us at our word that we are independent, then we would not do that. In my opinion, that's counterproductive. So John Keir is actually talking very, very short term there. And the longer interests of New Zealand, it depends on what we want to be as a country. And we've for a long time traded on the fact that we, or the supposition that we are an independent player. But many countries know the opposite, because they analyse what we do rather than what we say. So yes, it's, in my opinion, detrimental. Underneath the politeness of the Vietnamese, they don't forget it.
If we look at, you've raised the position of tradition, if you like, New Zealand positioning as an independent Pacific Island state. We've seen this in particular since the David Lange government in the 1980s. In most recent times, New Zealand's government and its push to actually become a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council used those credentials very, very persuasively to actually broker assistance from other nations to achieve that goal. Do you feel, as a former Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs, that you become an apologist for where New Zealand is tracking relating to its new brand of being closer to the Americans, being seen to be an active member of the Five Eyes spying alliance? Do you see yourself as an apologist for New Zealand's national interests, or do you see yourself in comparing to what New Zealand may return back to should there be a fundamental change in government?
Well, certainly what I see myself is as a representative of that strand of New Zealand, which have for a long time sought to establish that New Zealand will make its own decisions. Historically, of course, we were tainted with we were part of the British Empire, and we proudly, at one stage, of course, New Zealand had no apologies for that. Where Britain goes, we go, that type of talk. In the 1930s, the Labour Party started to strike out on a more independent position, and did that in the League of Nations, and its foreign policy clashed with where Britain was going. But generally, overall, was seen as loyal to the British Empire. Later on, of course, that switched to where America goes, we go, with the disastrous results of taking part in a war against Indochina which we've seen in other foreign policy where we just followed along. So if New Zealand, in its great majority, shows that it's totally independent, it makes its own decisions, and of course that's the basis of being nuclear weapon free, then where the key government is leading us is to say we've abandoned that position in terms of the fundamental issues of where we work militarily, in intelligence gathering. We put all our eggs in this one basket, and we believe the world should be run by these people, which is, in that alliance, United States and the UK are the big players, of course, with Canada, Australia and New Zealand trooping in behind. So in the world takes notice of this, and so we get away with it now to some extent, because the world has to keep going. It's not a massive threat to Vietnam's security at the moment, but its long-term interest means that a country, not just Vietnam, but other countries, will then have a look and weigh it up and say, well, New Zealand, if we're going to be working with them, we have to keep in mind that they are not independent. That's not good in the long term.
What we've seen is, particularly with the John Key government, that there's a motto, if you like, whatever it takes. Now, if you consider that the New Zealand government traditionally has had a trade-led foreign policy, and clearly there are other elements to it, but New Zealand's livelihood and its value, perhaps its positions in the region, are determined by its trade flows and its values that it acquires through there. So the whatever it takes element, what do you see are the advantages of the track that John Key is taking New Zealand, and what do you see as the major disadvantages, I mean in the medium-term area?
Okay. The short-term advantages are that you're more and more in the club. And we know that at top levels of New Zealand foreign policy making, and particularly from conservative parts of New Zealand foreign policy making, they're desperate to be at the table where Washington decides matters. When I was a foreign minister, I was told quite bluntly by a number of foreign affairs officials that when in doubt, look at how the Australians, or particularly the Americans, the Australians are voting. And then we just follow that, which gets you into situations like wars in Iraq and Vietnam if you follow it right through. So short term, yes, the United States is still the top dog in the world. But even from a pragmatic point of view, looking around at our region, this is a powerhouse, Vietnam. It's a powerhouse. It's, those people have fought a war. They're just amazing. I'm just in awe, really, with second or third time I've come here, how people recover in this way with the intelligence, the dedication. And they've got problems, but China, of course, is the other great power. And we've got good relations with China, and we're doing a lot there. But we need to have a more far-sighted policy, not just from the self-interest point of view, although clearly that comes in. If you want to continue to do well in this world, then look after your friends and don't rub their noses in things, and be independent. But there also comes the moral questions as well. If you're going to be able to take a position as we did in 2003 and not violate international law, not commit to the greatest state terrorist act of all, Blair and Bush war against the people in Iraq and that region, and for the consequences we now see, that's the long-term sort of thinking. If you go back to lessons such as where we stuck with support for apartheid until the bitter end, because that was, Mandela was a terrorist, Reagan said so, Thatcher said so, we said so. China, we didn't recognize China until 1972, until the ping-pong diplomacy, and Nixon moved ahead of us because of the self-interest in the United States. Coca-Cola, or I think Pepsi was his vehicle into China, not Coca-Cola. And New Zealand could have and would have had greater moral standing if they had much earlier, as many New Zealanders were pressing for, said this is ridiculous, shutting China up, pretending it doesn't exist, and it opened up friendly relations beforehand. We would have been ahead of the game, but not just, as I say, for economic gain, well, that's important. We have to live as a country in this world, but for the moral side of it as well, of what is the best for humanity, what is the best way to stop wars, what is the best way of getting dragged into conflicts which are not in either morally just, right with international law. And we have seen so many examples in New Zealand's history. Then we had to go back and study it. How did we get into the Boer War? Would we do that now with the type of policy that John Key is following? Yes, we probably would. Take ourselves back into the First World War. Would we have joined the First World War if we start thinking in terms of international law and where we stand? No. And we would have all those crosses in Europe of all those New Zealand young men who died? No. So there's big issues here, and we live in a world which is full of the type of conflicts that saw the breakout of both the Second World War and the First World War. And so we want to make sure, although we may not be able to avoid some of those conflicts because of the nature and the spread of them, that as much as possible we're on the side of the angels. At the moment, I think we're heading on the side of the devil.
If you look at it, Matt, quite simply, relating to spying on our trading partners, relating to spying on our regional friends, the GCSB spying is the cat out of the bag. The cat's out of the bag. What, in your view, should New Zealand government do now to correct what is potentially a problem of national interest proportions?
Well, the first thing they need is to trust their parliament. We do not have a parliamentary representative oversight committee of our spy agencies. Germany does, many other countries do. They have a look so that the parliament can say, yes, this is right, this is what we should be doing, because we're the representatives of the people. So it's in the hands of a very small group. Remind me of living in feudal Europe, that your betters know better. Your betters know what should be done. You just be quiet. And rather than in a modern world and in a democracy. And they hide behind these questions. There are dangerous forces out there. But we need to examine how these spying agencies work. What is the political agenda behind it? What is their analysis of the world? Because in my experience, as both a parliamentarian, a minister, and as a person involved in politics, the spying agencies in New Zealand were basically focused on there's all these dangerous people who've got dangerous thoughts because they read Noam Chomsky or John Pilger or, I don't know, support the Australian cricket team when they shouldn't. They're a danger to New Zealand. No one gave them the mandate to examine people's beliefs, ideas. We've spent a lot of money in New Zealand chasing around activists against the apartheid regime, those who opposed the war in Vietnam, those who worked for independent East Timor. They've been the targets of our spying agencies. I'd like to know how has it changed? Suddenly, very conveniently, we can talk about terrorism, but the terrorism thing is so loose and vague, and never much is talked about state terrorism. I mean, I give the example of the war against Iraq in 2003. That was state terrorism. There was no mandate for it. It wasn't international. Money had to be provided to carry out this war. Just as an example of trying to think more widely about what we use our intelligence gathering for, what is legitimate. So the first step would be, yes, a reevaluation, not just a committee that is set up and reports to the Prime Minister, but run by the Parliament so that there is scrutiny. And for goodness sake, I got sick in Parliament of hearing, that these matters are only senior responsible parliamentarians can control this. You're talking about people who are called responsible politicians but do irresponsible things. So if you have a democracy and you have a representative parliament, then those representatives should be able, with all due regard to what might be sensitive intelligence, etc., be able to ascertain on behalf of their people what is legitimate and what is not.
And while the questions of whether or not the John Key-led government is a credible brand at the moment, and this is consuming a lot of time back here in New Zealand at the moment, particularly as we said when we entered into this conversation, Matt, with New Zealand First having such a decisive win in Northland electorate. That issue of credibility, when the revelations came out that the GCSB, at the behest of the New Zealand government, one would presume, had been spying on the opponents of our Trade Minister, Tim Grosser, as he actually manoeuvred in his attempts to become the leader of the WTO. What does that say to you relating to the credibility of the John Key-led government in its essence even on the global stage?
Well, it says that they are prepared to tell lies and lie to their own people and lie to the world. And if you're going to have credibility, then you've got to allow people to take you at your word and say, when New Zealand speaks, there's no hidden agenda, there's no hidden motives behind what they're doing. And we're in great danger of losing that reputation because we do still have it. It's still there. It's not completely tarnished. And you'll find when people shake your hand at these international events, New Zealand, what a moral country, what a breath of fresh air in the world. And instead they find that there's a tradition there which ties us to the powers that have run the world for so long that we can't shake the habit.
Matt Robson, over in Hanoi at the moment, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I look forward to talking to you again perhaps when you're back in New Zealand.
Thank you.